But that's when we get into our next benefit of PC gaming. One of the things that I love the most is that you can play games however you want. Now, I know that a lot of people, especially on the console side, have this idea that with PC, everybody's wanting to play at the highest resolution, with the highest frame rates, everything else, and because of the fact that some ports are not as good, and because a lot of PC gamers are using lower spec hardware, they're not able to do those things. But the reality is that when it comes to PC gaming, we can play however we want, and it's not just about frame rates and resolution. Now, that is an added benefit, especially if you happen to have the latest and greatest graphics cards, or even if you have old graphics cards, you can still a lot of times get high resolution, high frame rate without any problems, both on current games and on old games. The fact of the matter is that when it comes to playing on PC, you are not limited to, you have to have the most powerful hardware in order to play this game. A lot of developers will customize their games to run first best on lower spec hardware. And when they do that, then anything above that, as I mentioned before, is going to run the game better. It's going to look better. You're going to have the ability to get higher resolution and all of that stuff simply by having better hardware. But the reality is that because of all the advantages of PC gaming, you don't have to have the best hardware. You don't. I have not upgraded my graphics card in 6 years. And even when I bought my graphics card, which is a 2080 Ti made by EVGA, rest in peace, I can still do the type of gaming that I want to do with that. For many years, my focus was 1080p high frame rates, 120 FPS or better. And recently I decided, okay, I was going to go ahead and upgrade my monitor. Went to 1440p with OLED and HDR. And because of that, I decided I knew that I was probably going to need to upgrade my CPU as well if I wanted to get more consistent high frame rates. And it was my choice, of course. I decided that I wanted to do higher resolution and still maintain those frame rates, and so I went for the upgrade. But it wasn't required, it was just, that was my decision. That's what I wanted to do. If I wanted to, though, I could continue playing games at 1080p on that monitor, and I would still be able to get those very high frame rates, get the 120 or higher FPS, and it's glorious. But the reality is that you can just as easily play on an old laptop. You can find an old laptop, and yeah, you're not going to be able to play all the newest games on really old hardware, but you can still play them. And you still have that freedom to play it however you want. One of the things that I hear very frequently from people, especially on the console side, is that they prefer playing on TV over playing on a monitor at a desk. Totally get that. That's something that a lot of people share that idea. But the fact of the matter is you can do that on PC. You can play on a TV. You can play on a monitor at a desk. You can play on an old CRT, whether an old CRT TV or an old CRT monitor. I know people who have more powerful PCs than I do, and they just like playing on a CRT because they like the way it looks. It looks really good on a CRT screen. That's their choice. You don't have to play at high frame rates. You can play at 30 frames per second. I know some people who have said there are times in the past where I've played a game at 20 frames per second, and I was perfectly happy because of the freedom that I had with PC. And, I think back to when I was still gaming on my laptop, my old laptop that I got back in 2010, and I was playing Grand Theft Auto 4, which I still have my copy of that. One of the things that I did was mod the game to where I could turn into the Hulk, and the frame rate was atrocious. Like, I think it was dropping down into single-digit frame rate because of that mod. I might even try recording some footage from that just to put in this video so you can see how bad it was. But I was having fun with it. Now, I didn't play that way for very long, and I typically don't do a whole lot with mods anyway, but it was still just like, I have this freedom. And because these games that I bought back then still work on my modern hardware and run better and look better than they did back then, not to mention all the mods that are available for various games. It just ends up being an even better experience. The other thing is that you're not required to play at native resolution. I mean, despite the misconception, consoles typically aren't playing games at native resolution, at least not when it gets up to 4K. A lot of times you're having dynamic resolution, or you're using different types of upscaling, checkerboard rendering, that sort of thing. We're not going to get into all of that, but there's nothing wrong with that. You know, that's how they choose to make it so that you can run these games at least what looks like 4K. But you can do the same thing on PC. You can do dynamic resolution. You can do upscaling. You know, DLSS, especially in its current state, is actually really, really good. AMD's FSR, I think 4 is supposed to be really good. I haven't had a chance to see it firsthand. 3 and lower, though, in my opinion, are garbage. But the fact of the matter is that you can still use all these different options to run a game however you want. And if you want the game to look better, but run at a 30 frames per second because you're happy with that, then you can do that. If you want the game to run better and look worse, you can do that. You can customize the settings however you want, if you want to, but it's not required. And the reality is that despite the misconception, you actually can just start up a game without doing anything with settings, because 99% of games will automatically detect the quality of your hardware, what type of specs you have, and it will just run it on a preset or some customized version of that. Usually it's going to be a preset, but you can absolutely just run the game that way if you want, or you can tweak it. You have the ability to make the game look better or run better however you see fit. That's one of the things that also ends up being really a boon for PC gaming, because we're on console, you're limited to whatever it is the developer decides to do for you. If they want it to be the best looking game but only run at 30 frames per second, guess what? That's where you're stuck. If the developer wants to make it run at 60 frames per second but have a lower resolution, then you're stuck. You might have a couple of different presets, but the reality is that in general, you're not going to necessarily be able to get it the way that you want it to be. That will make it simpler, but the fact is you can still have that simple experience on PC. It's just a question of whether that's what you actually want. And in my case, I typically will mess with the settings as I see fit to get up to 60 frames per second minimum. If I'm doing it on the Steam Deck, I will occasionally settle for 30 if it's like a really demanding game. But typically I'm going to aim for 60, or if I can't get or maintain 60 enough, I'll go for 40. A game like Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, I've been playing on my Steam Deck almost exclusively, and I've been getting a near locked 60 frames per second, apart from a couple areas where the frame rate drops. But the fact that I can do that on a handheld, because of the fact that I have the ability to mess with the settings as I see fit, that is incredibly wonderful to have. I'm not limited by what the developer provides or doesn't provide. All I have to do is take what's available to me and do what I want with my game. I play my games how I want to play them. Sometimes that's going to be a higher frame rate with lower resolution. Other times it's going to be a higher resolution with a slightly lower frame rate. Something else, a lot of people think, oh, well, you're not going to be able to play with the DualSense, for example. And you don't get all of the, the really cool features of the DualSense, what frankly are gimmicks. Not saying all of them are bad, sometimes they're actually really great, like in Returnal. But you actually can do that on PC. You can do it wired, you can do it wireless. You can do it either way you want. I do wired most of the time when I'm doing controllers, just because that way I don't have to worry about battery. And usually I'm sitting right at my desk anyway, so it's not a problem. But you can use those controllers, those current controllers. You can use earlier controllers. Heck, you can use controllers from your original NES or your Super Nintendo or your PS1 or your PS2 or your GameCube or your Xbox. You have so many different options of different controllers you can use. You can even use some of those really janky controllers that were made specifically for Windows back in the day before they started really supporting all those things. And most of the time, all it requires at most is some type of adapter to use these old controllers, which is pretty cool. I mean, honestly, it is. One of the things that's been interesting recently is I've been playing Minecraft Dungeons with my kids. I've ended up using my old Wii U Pro controller on there. And it's been great because it's a great controller, but I barely used it on my Wii U because I was always using the gamepad. And just features like that are just so cool to be able to do that. I love that choice. And of course, obviously, you also have the option of using mouse and keyboard. And I will use mouse and keyboard for shooters a lot of times, things like Destiny 2, when I was playing that more heavily, or other games like that. But I can use mouse and keyboard if I want, or I can use a controller. And I'll use a controller for the vast majority of games, but that's the freedom that you have in how you play your games. You play how you want.